Hello everybody, welcome. Well, I've got the diehards. I'm very impressed with you lot, certainly. Well, you do realise that the information for your essays is up on Views. I trust you've already read it. So I trust you've realised that the guest lectures are incredibly important to your essay. So, yes, you have one of those guest lecturers here in person. So if I were you, I would take the advantage of asking questions should they come up for you. Okay? Now today we've got the Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Psychology, Professor Kevin Dunn. And Kevin's going to be speaking with you on Australians' attitudes to human rights. So I'd like you to welcome Professor Dunn, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, so as I read, the aim of the lecture today was to outline what we know about Australians' views on the importance of human rights. We might be convinced ourselves of the universal nature of human rights, of the importance of them, that they're essential for human civility around the world. We might have read literature, and as part of your subject this year, that affirmed that scholars and that the UN even agree that human rights are important and they ought to be universal. And there's global agreement on that in the form of the UN Declaration, as you would be aware. But what do ordinary people think about the importance of human rights? How well do people think they are currently protected in Australia? And which human rights do people think are most important? Which types of human rights? I'll draw principally on some recent data that was carried out towards the end of the noughties by Colma Brunton Social Research, and that was commissioned as part of the National Human Rights Consultation by the Federal Attorney General's Department about 6 years ago, and remains the best data set that we have on Australian attitudes about human rights. I'll supplement, though, that with some data from the Challenging Racism Project work, which is based here at Western Sydney University, which has included national surveys on things like attitudes about diversity and people's experiences of racism, because I'll draw on that as case study material. I'm also asked, in terms of the aims of this lecture, to say something specific about Australian attitudes to the human rights of asylum seekers as a vulnerable group. And I'll do that. So I'll also draw on some data that we have and that is available that gives us an insight into what people's attitudes might be, ordinary people's attitudes might be about asylum seekers and their human rights. Research on human rights internationally has tended to neglect public awareness and public attitudes, and that's somewhat regrettable, you would think. The extent of public support for human rights is going to be pretty important to the extent to which we can defend human rights. Going to be important to our ability to pass laws, to encourage governments to act, etc. So public support is critical to sustaining a civil society where human rights are respected, and yet, as I've said, is under-researched. There's plenty of research about human rights, plenty of research about transgressions of human rights, but not much on people's attitudes about it. From my research today, as part that I'm presenting in this lecture, and if I was to characterise the problems or challenges that I perceive, and you should be looking for these as I progress through the lecture, they would be that there is complacency, that this might be a concern in terms of human rights in Australia and attitudes towards them, that there might be a lack of awareness of human rights violations. And I'll spend a little bit of time outlining another issue, and that is that insofar as public opinion goes, Australian attitudes go, there's some non-universality in that opinion, both across groups and through time. In other words, that principle of human rights, of universality, that is, that a human right is inalienable across time and across space, it's universal. That principle is not so strongly entrenched as we would hope in public opinion. And then finally, I'm also concerned that we are victim-centric in our approaches to defending human rights. So, key issues and challenges that you should be looking for in today's lecture. I linked to Young's social philosophy on oppression and social justice to generate some insights and to provide the conceptual basis for today's lecture. So, that's the plan. Colmer Brunton, the researchers who did this survey as part of the National Human Rights Consultation in the latter part of the noughties, surveyed, they included a question which asked whether or not human rights were important. And fortunately, 75% of Australians said that human rights are important. Thank goodness for that. But it does make us straight away think about, why did 25% of people say no? Why would a quarter of the Australian population not agree that human rights are important? Second important datum, I thought, headline datum that was in the Colmer Brunton report was on how well enough people thought human rights were protected. How adequately are human rights protected? 64% of people thought that human rights were adequately protected in Australia. You can see that in that graphic there, being the agree and strongly agreed sum together, 20 and 44, to equal 64%. This is an indicator of complacency. Only 7% saw a problem with the protection of human rights in Australia. So there's one, and our first measure in this lecture, of the extent and nature of public concern, and my assertion, which I'll back with some other data, that there's some complacency. Colmer Brunton made the general observation that there was a poor knowledge of human rights in Australia and a poor knowledge of how they were protected. This is the conclusion of their report. Only 45%, you'll see this in that graphic, only 45% of those surveyed said that they thought Australians were well aware of their own human rights, while 13% disagreed and therefore thought that Australians did know enough about their rights. But nonetheless, that leaves 42% who could not express a view. That's in the white there, just couldn't say, so they're in ignorance. And then 45% who agreed that they did have a level of awareness of human rights. And you can see the quote there from Colmer Brunton. They say, while participants felt they could resolve a human rights issue if one arose to them, they do not have a clear idea of what avenues they could use. In general, Colmer Brunton came to a view that there's a need for increased human rights education for children and adults. In fact, that transpired as the key finding of the national consultation led by Father Frank Brennan. So this survey by Colmer Brunton, researchers, private researchers, commissioned by the Attorney General's Department to get the data, handed then to Frank Brennan as part of his national consultation. His conclusions find that the number one problem is lack of awareness of human rights issues. I said I'd provide some data to support some of the points that I'm making, particularly when I'm referring to challenges and issues. And I am going to draw on the challenges in racism data and what it tells us about racism. Surveys conducted in the ACT in South Australia in 2007 found that 87% of respondents stated that racist conduct and abuse was against the law. 87% of people thought that racism was illegal. Well, it's not technically true, actually. Racial discrimination is. Prejudicial treatment across services and goods is illegal. But saying something racist isn't necessarily illegal, or not in some states anyway. But anyway, 87% of people thought that it was. And 4/5 of the public were aware that you could complain to a Human Rights Commission if you experienced racism. 75% thought that this in regard to the national level Australian Human Rights Commission, but 80% nonetheless thought they could make a complaint to a Human Rights Commission. But very few, only 4 in 10, had seen or heard information about racism from the Human Rights Commission or from a Human Rights Commission in their states. So only a quarter of the ACT respondents had seen material from their own territory-based Human Rights Commission. So this goes back to the point made by Colma Brunton, that people were broadly aware that they had rights, but didn't know largely how they would go about protecting their own rights even. Or many didn't. So in this key area of human rights, in this instance racism and ethnic discrimination, the levels of outreach by the organisations responsible for redress are quite modest. Colma Brunton asked, and this is again I think another piece of evidence that we have for complacency, asked the respondents in their survey whether their own human rights had ever been transgressed. And about 10% of respondents said that they had suffered a human rights infringement. And about 10%, another 10% said someone close to them had. So either themselves or vicariously, 20% had an experience of a human rights transgression. I think that's an under-enumeration and it feeds into complacency. And I make that assertion based again on the data that we have from spheres like the experience of racism. Colma Brunton made the fair point that these low levels of human rights infringements may explain why there are low levels of knowledge about human rights as well. So low levels of infringement might be linked to poor awareness. Well, I think that's probably true, but I think it goes the other way as well. This would be a reflexive relationship, not just a linear one. In other words, if you don't know about human rights, you might not know that your own have been transgressed, or you might not read them as such. If you don't know about human rights, then you might not know that somebody close to you's human rights have been transgressed. So these things would be reflexive. Lack of knowledge can generate an ignorance of infringement as well as the other way around. Whose rights are infringed? Colma Brunton said, asked the public, who is it that suffers human rights transgressions in this country? People were generally aware that there are some groups. Colma Brunton described this attitude as people thought that there are some groups who slip between the cracks, that aren't looked after, who fall between the cracks and the human rights are not properly protected. You can see the quote there from Colma Brunton's report to the national consultation. They tended to have little specific knowledge, though, they say, of exactly who these groups were. But they were aware that they existed in the community. In other words, there is in Australia an ignorance of which groups of people suffer infringements of their human rights. As I say, the number one recommendation of this data, and indeed of the report of the National Human Rights Consultation in 2009, as tabled to the federal government, was this issue of awareness and the need for awareness raising. As you can see here, the committee recommends that education be the highest priority for improving and promoting human rights in Australia. And indeed, the government then responded, and you can see here the statement of the Attorney-General, that they understood that the review had shown there are many ways to protect and promote human rights, including, and primarily, they agreed, through enhanced education and improved parliamentary scrutiny. So the government then made a commitment to foster an Australian culture where fundamental human rights of all people were respected and protected. And they allocated $10 million for awareness raising. And that was it. And if you haven't heard much about it, well, because that's not much money either in terms of public policy interventions. It did generate some cross-curriculum material for schools, and some resources for use in teaching, and those are still knocking around and are used within some schools and the like. But after all of this consultation, should we have a Bill of Rights? Do we need new laws? Do we need to empower our human rights commissions? Lots and lots of inquiry. In the end, $10 million for an awareness raising campaign. But that's another issue. Colmer-Brunton made clear from their survey that there were a hierarchy of sympathies in Australia towards the groups whose human rights are said to have been placed at risk or infringed. A hierarchy of sympathies. And I'll show you this in a moment. I might go to the graphic first. It's a little bit of a busy set of bar charts here. But what it's saying is, for each of these groups, do you feel their human rights need to be given more or less or the same amount of protection? So for these groups, do they need more, less, or should they have the same amount of human rights protection as they have now? And in blue is the proportion of people who said those groups need more help. The white in the middle, groups where the level of human rights protection is adequate, and less in the salmon. These are groups where Australians said that these vulnerable peoples should get less human rights protection. And the list of groups, of course, are those that you would be familiar with from this unit already, and that have been identified internationally and globally as vulnerable peoples, and using the language of the United Nations, etc. And the hierarchies of sympathy are quite clear. There's a perceived need for the protection of the mentally ill, the disabled, the elderly. Almost 3/4 of Australians see the need for more protection of those groups. So that's where you see the 75, 72, 71%. Children, people from remote areas, including Indigenous Australians in remote areas, include some level of support or a feeling that they should have more support. But there is much less support for the protection of the human rights of Aboriginals in urban locations, for gay, lesbian, transsexual, intersex people, and refugees and asylum seekers. Indeed, 30% of respondents were of the view that asylum seekers should have less human rights protection. This is a very profound statistic because asylum seekers are some of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable peoples on the planet. On this planet, we have the United Nations Human Rights, United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and we have the United Nations. And we give power to state parties, nations. We give responsibility to nations to protect the human rights of people on this planet. Nations are the signatories to the United Nations. And we rely on nation states, state parties, to use the language of the United Nations, to protect our human rights. And asylum seekers are in a unique circumstance of not being able to rely upon their nation state to provide that assistance. So they are, technically, definitionally, the most vulnerable people on the planet. They rely upon someone else's government and another state to protect their human rights and look after them. And so it is all the more surprising then that 30% of Australians would have such a negative view. So there's just a summary of some of the things you would have saw in the chart there in terms of the varying sympathies, the hierarchy of sympathies in terms of the human rights of vulnerable groups in Australia. Why might you have such hierarchies? Colmer-Brunton say it might point in part to the differing levels of power of some of these groups. That is, that the mentally ill and disabled are less empowered themselves, and whereas other groups are more empowered. I'll come back to that in a moment. Other groups that for who Australians had less sympathy. My assertion would be, and this is the last point on this slide, that the way these groups are represented in society, in our popular culture, in news media, say for instance in particular, but in political debate, those representations of these groups fundamentally influence the sympathies of Australians. Here's a bit of data that I just put together this morning from a survey that we finished late last year. commissioned by SBS. SBS are going to run some documentaries on racism this year and next year, and we're the academic consultants on that project, and so we undertook a survey, and we'll do another one this year, and about 5,000 Australians nationwide. And we asked some questions about attitudes to asylum seekers. Here's the first prompt. Australia should help refugees fleeing persecution in their homeland, to which there was a set of Likert scale response options. Strongly agree, agree, neither, disagree, strongly disagree. Summing together the agrees and the strongly agrees, 54% of people thought that Australia should help refugees fleeing persecution. That's good. But by the same token, why would 30% of people not be able to express a view on that? And why would 13% disagree with that? Why would, 45% of Australians either disagree that Australia should help refugees or just not be able to offer a view? 43% agreed that every boat carrying an asylum seeker should be turned back. 43%. Every boat, in every circumstance. Question. So the question is about who were the sample and how does political debate and electoral agendas feed into this. And I will address those points. First of all, the sample, 5,000 Australians. This is from using the My Opinion sample frame, which is about 30,000 Australians who are paid to answer surveys. And then we randomised them so that within that sample we got a diversity of the Australian population. So it's an online survey. In this instance, we never used to. We used to use telephone surveys, but now we use online surveys, and this is from the My Opinion sample. So it's a diverse group of Australians. Some might have differing visa statuses as well, and I'm not quite sure what the spread is. And that's superior to the old telephone surveys, which tended to neglect people on who weren't citizens because it relied on people only who had landlines. But anyway, 43%. I'll come to the politics in a moment. This survey was undertaken during the Abbott Prime Ministership, and the prompt was put, do you think the current Abbott Liberal government is too tough, too soft on asylum seekers? And 20% agreed that they were too soft. And 50% said they got it spot on. And it was a tough government disposition in the Abbott government. Still is, has been for years. A really tough set of government policies in regards to asylum seekers. 50% of Australians agree that it's right, and 20% say it's too soft. The politics. And it's not just the Abbott government, it's not just Liberals. It has been a bipartisan policy position that refugees are a problem. And this has been the government disposition on asylum seekers and refugees now for almost 2 decades. And they are a problem, and they need to be stopped by whatever means necessary, including imposing hardship upon them and through tough policies like turning back boats. I've got some data here from work done by Clocker. Very interesting work. She did an analysis for a period between August 2001 and January 2002, where she analysed every government statement about refugees and asylum seekers. And the first type of analysis she did was, are they positive towards asylum seekers? Are they negative about them? Mixed or neutral? And remembering, we're talking about, definitionally, the most disadvantaged people on the planet. And yet, 91% of the government documents were negative in their dispositions towards asylum seekers. Only a handful were able to be described in terms of their evaluative tenor as positive. Quite amazing. She also then analysed media analysis in a couple of key newspapers. From memory, Adelaide-based newspapers. The Adelaide Advertiser, a daily newspaper, their Sunday stablemate, the Sunday Mail, and then also a local newspaper called the Transcontinental from Port Augusta. And she found that, similarly there, very negative. Not as negative as government, but similarly negative. What was interesting, though, was then she looked at the ways asylum seekers were described. And she was able to even show how, over that period, a government would introduce a new way of talking about asylum seekers, and the media would pick it up. That there was strong intertextuality between the government texts and the media. It's pretty disappointing that the mediation was so straightforward. But there you have it. Let's speculate on what theory there might be, or look to theory to help us understand why this might occur. And I want to go now to the work of Iris Marion Young, the American social philosopher. And she has an amazing book on social justice and oppression. And she has this chapter called The 5 Faces of Oppression. And indeed, I think in some of your core units they make reference to this in some of the textbooks. And she says that there are 5 main types of oppression. I don't want to go through them all today, but I'll direct your attention to the first one, cultural imperialism, which she says is the foundational oppression. It is an oppression where you construct a people, a group, as deviant, or as otherwise wrong or not normal. And this is done through stereotyping, or by constructing a norm to which these people don't ascribe or match. And she said that this form of oppression was foundational because it facilitates all the others. But you can't do the work of exploitation and marginalisation until you have made it okay to do so. You make it okay to do so by portraying a group as lesser or ill-fitting or deviant. If they suffer cultural imperialism, then it increases the likelihood that they will suffer forms of oppression, that their human rights are more likely now to be infringed. If there's a poor popular image of a vulnerable group, it will also be difficult to generate public sympathy for them. It will be difficult to generate government action, actions of NGOs to protect the human rights of that group. In analysing public opinion, Colmer Brunton came to a view that the sympathies were stronger for those groups who were least able to defend their human rights. They didn't go where I did with my analysis. Their analysis of the unevenness, they went to how empowered are these groups. The ones that are least empowered seem to be the ones that we have the most sympathy for. Children, those with mental illness, those requiring more assistance and protection, they said. It makes sense. But it also shows a differing perceived level of empowerment is associated with those groups, those vulnerable groups for whom there was less support. Clearly refugees are, or have been, in dire straits, and this ought be widely known, but it clearly isn't. To the data again from Clocker. Busy table here, but she didn't just analyse the government text and the media for their positive or negative tenor. She then looked to see what themes are in here, what words are used. Here the words, a manifest content analysis of the words used to describe asylum seekers and refugees. In the first instance, DPS, that means the government statements and from the department, ministerial statements, MPS and TS transcripts of what politicians had to say. And you can see that, again, it's mostly negative terms, 90%, and the sorts of words that have been used portray or describe asylum seekers as illegal, illegitimate, as threats. So what is happening here is they're being constructed as calculating and active people who strategically negotiate borders and laws and do so illegally. So this affirms, in a sense, the argument of Colma Brunton around how empowered or less empowered. So the trick to constructing the asylum seekers in a negative way is to construct them as empowered, strategic, calculating, and therefore deserving of inhumane treatment, to pick it up on the social philosophy of Iris Marion Young. So, unevenness in human rights protection, or at least Australians are uneven. They don't see human rights as being universal across groups. That's a concern for us. If we think that universality is a bedrock of human rights protection on this planet. All right, just spacing for time, just in case there's anything on this slide that people wanted to note down before I move on. Case study on racism. Led by a project called the Challenging Racism Project, still very active, based at Western Sydney University, in our school in fact, and but involving a series of other universities and government organisation agencies like human rights commissions, etc. This survey for this data was carried out in 2006. It was expressly focused on people's experience of racism in 4 different types of ways. You know, being target of racist talk, or maybe being made to feel like you don't belong, or people avoiding you because of your ethnic background or religion, or prejudicial treatment, unfair treatment, not getting the rental property, not getting the job or the interview because of your background, or indeed racist attack. You see the percentages there. Fortunately, only about 6% of Australians the focus of such racist attack or the threat of it. But 1 in 5 experiencing race hate talk in our society. Those people who told us they'd experienced race hate talk, we asked them, how does it manifest? And you can see here the data. For 65%, it would have been verbal abuse. For 63%, stereotypical comments about their group. But the most common form in which race talk occurs in Australia was being called an offensive slang name for your cultural group, 3/4 of the time. 3/4 of those people who'd experienced race hate talk experienced racism in that form. So this is the most prevalent form of racism in Australia. I think it's also an indicator, or both of those sets of data are, of underestimation as well. For 34%, or a third, it was a pretty rare thing, or for 15 it only ever happened once. But for the rest, it happened either often or occasionally, for 1/4 occasionally, and for 15% often. So fairly high rates of experience of racism too. We know from the international literature that the more frequent this experience is, the more likely it is to have associations with all sorts of morbidities and economic costs and others. Anyway. Next point. Not only then is there an experience of racism, and this is how it's manifest, but it is culturally uneven. So the exposure to racism in Australia is culturally uneven. Some cultural groups bear the burden more than others. If we were to just, first of all, do a cross-tabulation by those who speak a language other than English and those who don't, and that's sort of an indicator of Anglo, not Anglo. Okay, it's not perfect, but it's what we use as an indicator. Language other than English, LOTE. 1/3 had experienced racist talk, whereas amongst the Anglo, the non-LOTE, only 15% on average. Christian, non-Christian variation as well. Next slide has some more dramatic variations. Look at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander from Oceania. 63%. So that would be your Maori and Aboriginals in Australia. And Pacifica. North African, Middle Eastern backgrounds, people of the Americas, high as well in that. So there's unevenness. I've got a case study then of some data, a slightly different survey, a bigger survey, in which it so happened that we collected responses from about 150 people who were born in India or Sri Lanka. And you can just see when we just pick out one birthplace group, and we could do it for others, we pick out one birthplace group, particularly a visible minority, the dramatic variations in the extent to which they're exposed to racism compared to the average. So looking at in the workplace, 41% told us that they'd experienced racism, that they'd experienced racism because of their ethnic origin in that circumstance. 41%. The Australian average was only 13%, 12.8. And then you can see how that trend follows for those others. We've just did a major report on the experiences of Muslims in Sydney. And we included the same questions, and that report was launched in December last year. And if you look at that, the rates of experience of racism in the workplace for Sydney Muslims is 60%. 60%. 3 times the national average at 17. Where does this particular type of infringement of human rights occur? Taking that most frequent form of racism, race hate talk, being called a slang name for your cultural group, 75% of those instances of hate talk, and asking some detail then, asking for some detail about where it occurred and what people did about it. I'll come to what people did about it in a moment. But first of all, where does it occur? And you can see it's in public spaces. This particular racism is something which happens around us, not in private. The national surveys that challenging racism have been running, and this was replicated recently in the SBS poll we did last year, show that most Australians acknowledge that there's a problem with racism in the country. Here's the question prompt. There is racial prejudice in Australia, to which people can agree or disagree, and 85% agree that there is. Only 8% disagree. Denial, pretty low. It's positive. It's negative. It's negative because it says, oh man, that's high. It's positive because there's a large level of public acknowledgement. You would think a strong basis to support public action and actions by governments and others to confront this issue. They also asked the question, do Australians of a British background enjoy a privileged position in our society? Testing cultural privilege. There's less support for that. Only 40%, 41% almost, would agree that there's privilege, cultural privilege. Almost the same proportion disagree with that, deny. In other words, Australians are saying, yes, there's racism, but I'm not quite prepared to go so far as to say that there are cultural winners and losers from that. 12% only admitted that they were prejudiced themselves. Similar data asked in the 2006 survey, something should be done to minimise or fight racism in Australia, 85% agree. So we see that this figure on public support or recognition is pretty strong. We're finding it in all different ways of asking the question. And even if you put the question the other way, as a despondent proposition, nothing can be done, 82% disagree. And that's a tough thing. To disagree with something in a survey is a strong indicator of opinion. Findings relevant to human rights then. That many Australians experience racism in their daily lives. That Australians of certain ethnic backgrounds are the focus of that antipathy and intolerance. Have I got this on the slide? Yes, sorry. that Australians acknowledge that there are serious and sustained infringements of human rights, in the form of racism, at least. And that Australians support, or would support, the development of anti-racism, by extension for that, the protection of human rights, one would imagine. You may recall I said I have some concerns, and there are challenges. Universality is one of them, or non-universality. And we looked at how there were varying sympathies across the vulnerable peoples or groups. But there are also hierarchies of rights, it would seem, as well, in public attitudes. In other words, some rights are seen as more important than others. We all might be sitting here right now and thinking, yeah, well, I probably think that too. I want to look at that. And there are also different sources for our positions about human rights. I want to suggest that as well. And this is a much more profound challenge to universality. I'll come back in a moment. But, you know, the reasons why we think a human right is important and maybe another is not so important, the reasons for that are quite contextual. So my ambition is to explain those 2 points. Which human rights first are more important? Busy bar chart from Colmer Brunton. Whole set of rights which people are prompted, and the response options were then, in terms of the importance of those rights, to say that they're very important, important neither, or unimportant or very unimportant. Unimportant. And the very unimportant in the tan, and the unimportant in the salmon, and in the blues representing importance. And it shows that the level of support for given types of human rights do vary dramatically. For example, 81% said that healthcare, food, water, clothing, shelter are very important human rights. Not just important, very important human rights. Around 80% for those human rights. Whereas only about 29% thought that the right to demonstrate, to form political parties, were very important. And only 41% thought freedom of association was very important. Some rights were characterised as absolute rights in some of the qualitative focus groups that Colmer Brunton did with Australians. Human rights that people thought should never be removed or suspended, or which were important to survival, such as those ones I made reference to before. They put there a sort of list, I'm not sure if I've got it though, of absolute rights, qualified rights and desirable rights. There's no intellectual basis for this grouping that Colmer Brunton put together. It's not linked to any theory or literature from the human rights research. It's not linked to anything legal either. But this is something that they could see, they thought, in the Australian thinking. It's not a particularly useful characterisation for us either. There's not much we can do with it. But nonetheless, it does show that there's this hierarchy. And it also shows that there's qualified support for some human rights. And if they're qualified, or just seen as desirable rather than inalienable, well then this is perhaps a challenge to us. Hurtle and others did a survey in America. 500 Americans were surveyed by Hurtle and others, and they found that some rights were valorised more highly and universally than others. Some were seen as less protected from violation and could be violated in certain circumstances. So you can see that some research done internationally is finding similar things. That's the only point I'm making with that. Colmer Brunton asked Australians what were the circumstances in which it was okay to suspend human rights. Suspend, which is parlance for transgress human rights. Okay? And they were in some instances when individuals have not met their own responsibilities to society, when individuals had been non-reciprocal. Some people thought that's a circumstance in which human rights can be suspended for that individual. Or when it's in the short-term interest of the broader community, when it's considered to be in the public good. These are the sorts of reasons that people would put forward for why it might be okay in some circumstances to suspend an individual's human rights. I want to go then to this next point about suspension of human rights of an individual and of a group, and refer to this data first, these two pie charts. So the prompt, first of all, was if an individual does not respect the wider community's rights, it is reasonable to reduce or take away some of their rights. This is the prompt that was put. And the dark blue and the light blue are the agrees, and then the tan and the buff are the disagrees. And you can see that 57% agreed that if an individual does something disrespectful or against the community, then it's okay to suspend their human rights. And many of you might agree with that. Let's think about some examples. If someone commits a murder or some other sort of crime, what do we do with them once we find that they're guilty? Anyone know? We put them in prison. Now, if you put someone in prison and you make them stay there, what human right might you have transgressed or suspended? Freedom of movement. Exactly. So that sounds reasonable, doesn't it? We'd agree that maybe we can suspend the human rights of that individual in that circumstance. Next problem. If some members of a group abuse the wider community's rights, it is reasonable to restrict that entire group's rights. In other words, then, someone from a particular cultural group does something that we don't like, the rest of us, and we might then suspend the human rights of that group. And 41% of Australians think that's a reasonable thing to do. What do you reckon? Does that sound reasonable? Can we think of a circumstance in where it would be? That's tougher, isn't it? And it's concerning that 41% of Australians would agree that this sounds reasonable. 33% couldn't offer a view. This rationale for the suspension of human rights historically on this planet has given rise to some of the most profound human rights violations we have ever seen. You construct a group as deviant, you point to some examples of what some of the members of a group may have done, you generalise that, stereotype, cultural imperialism, you suspend the human rights of the group, and then you're free as a vested interest or a government, for whatever reason, to undertake the other forms of oppression identified by Iris Marion Young in her 5 Faces of Oppression. The consultants, Coleman Brunton, did some focus groups. I made brief reference to that a moment ago. They didn't just do surveys, they did some focus groups too. And they asked people about this, prompted them on it. And there was a lot of discussion in those groups. It's in there in the report, some qualitative comment about some unease about that, and reference to bikie laws that were being devised in some parts of outlawed motorcycle gangs that were being developed in some parts of Australia, and a concern that was inappropriate because the actions of a small group of people were then leading to laws that impeded the freedoms and the human rights of whole groups. Similarly, people would complain, just because there's a few child abusers, why do we all have to fill in these forms all the time just if we want to coach a local football club? Those sorts of things were issues that people raised. Making all Indigenous people in Northern Territory, all Aboriginals, not have money but have cards that they can own, or vouchers that they can use, that this was an inappropriate way to treat a whole group just because a handful of people have been involved in child abuse. Were some of the cases that people did make reference to. Which human rights are more important than others? We talked about that already. That's the survey from Hertel and others that I made reference to a moment ago, but in this instance a different piece of data. They showed that in this instance some rights were very important to Americans, like freedom from torture, whereas others are not seen as so strongly supported. So you can see here in these middle set of column charts, more of those, freedom of thought and expression was seen as more of a desirable thing rather than those others, freedom from torture and minimum living standards, which were seen not as desirable as such. But anyway, it's just not much data on these things, and so scrambling a bit to find evidence across the world other than what we have in Australia. So that's the first part of this next section that I'm covering. I also said I was interested in outlining to you the differing bases or sources for human rights support. Let's, if you forgive me for the moment, use the phrase tolerance discourses to explain why people come to have what we might call a pro-multicultural or an anti-racist disposition. Okay, why people might be tolerant of cultural diversity. Okay, lots of problems with that phrase, but for now let's use that. And some work done by Lamont and Aksatova in 2002. They compared the bases of anti-racism in Canada and France, amongst working class people, I think, mostly, but Canada and France, and then they sort of went global, and they said that there were different reasons people would point to explain why they were pro-diversity, anti-racist, tolerant, however you want to describe it. And in some countries, these different discourses were more important than in others. So republicanism was a strong basis for anti-racist thought in France. Lots of French people, when asked, why do you think we should be tolerant of difference, they pointed to their democratic principles associated with republicanism. Republicanism. In America, though, it was more likely, and also in Canada, that people would point to meritocratic explanations. And that's there somewhere, economic meritocracy. Everybody should have the ability to rise up. That this was a very common explanation for why people said in America that we should be tolerant of different racial groups and ethnic groups. And we've added one there to this list for Australia. Digger nationalism, fair go. Everybody should be given a chance. Everybody should be given a fair hearing, depending on your particular definitional understanding of fair go. So what this set of discourses tell us is that the fundamental underpinnings in a society for human rights might vary as well. The reason people support human rights in one country might be different for the reason that people support human rights in another. The reasons people support human rights in one city might be different from a suburb and from another city. This is a much more fundamental challenge to universality, isn't it? We can't deny it, but the reasons for people being supportive of human rights might vary. There might be different national bases for tolerance and therefore support for human rights. Let me put some empirical material on this from some research carried out that I led about 10 years ago on attitudes about women wearing headscarves in Australia. So a government agency collected some data from memory, about 1,300, might be on the next slide, yeah, about 1,300 people were surveyed, and they were asked for their opinions on Muslim women in Australia wearing headscarves. And I was just asked to analyse this. I didn't devise the questionnaire, and there's some problems with it, but this is what they asked. many women in Australia wear headscarves. Which of the following statements best describes your view? First is, it does not bother me. I think it's inappropriate. I think it should be banned. And 81% of Australians said they weren't bothered. 13% said they didn't think it was appropriate. And 4% said it should be banned. It's very interesting data, actually, because it was very inconsistent with similar data that had been collected in Europe, where 50% of Germans said wearing headscarves should be banned. 75% of French people said it should be banned, not just inappropriate, banned. So it was showing some very high degrees of tolerance, if we want to use that word, for headscarf wearing in Australia. But the reason I've shown you this is this. The survey company then asked the people who'd offered those views why they had the view they had. I want to go now to the 81% who said they were not bothered. So why aren't you bothered? Survey asks. And then you get all this open response, which we then coded. And the two dominant bases of tolerance in the Australian mind were, one, freedom of religion, and then the other, individual liberty. I'm not sure if I've got examples of these quotes. No, I don't. So I'll just have to give you some tasters of what sorts of things that people said. In terms of freedom of religion, people would say, we have freedom of religion in this country. They would say that. Or they would say, if their religion mandates that they wear hijab, then they should be allowed to. Now, whether or not we agree, and there's debate about whether Islam does mandate that, it doesn't matter. That's what people thought, or these people, and they said, therefore, freedom of religion. It's an important form of human right. That's a group-based right that people are asserting. Half of those who said they weren't bothered, almost, were making reference to freedom of religion. About another half of the tolerance discourses of Australians were references to individual liberty. This is a very different human right, isn't it? They would say it's every individual's human right to wear what they like, people would say. I can wear jeans, they can wear a scarf. These were the sorts of things people would make reference to. Individual human rights of expression, dress, whatever. This is a free country, each to their own. Again, languages that people would use. The twin message from these data is that there are complicated drivers of tolerance, and therefore I would argue complicated drivers of respect for human rights. They include the rights of the individual expression, also group rights, like in this instance the case of religious freedoms. And religious freedom as a group right is strongly developed in Australia, and that's again contextual. It comes out of the resolution of sectarian division in this country. So the division between Catholic and Protestant was profound in this country and required a lot of discourse and law and development against that. And so you see that still in the public mind. It might mean that people support human rights so long as they are about individuals, or it might mean that they support human rights if it's about a group right to expression. Coleman Brunton are a private research organisation. Many social scientists who graduate from universities end up working for these sorts of companies. They did the focus groups, they did the survey. With the survey data, they were able to do some complicated analytics. Not just bivariate analysis, but multivariate analysis, where you throw everything in and you see what's linked to what in the survey. What opinions are linked to what? And from this multivariate analysis, they identified, this is actually a form of factor analysis that was used, they identified 5 groups of people in the survey, according to their mix of attitudes. And the 5 that I've got listed here are those people who think the human rights situation in Australia is fine, the complacents. Those who would, in fact, be against human rights a bit. They're of the view, in fact, that the good of society trumps human rights. Too individualistic, if we're talking about human rights all the time. And then there are those who would argue that there is no balance at the moment. In fact, there's too much human rights. So going a little bit further. And then there were two other groups who thought that human rights need stricter protection and consideration. And then there were a group who even went further and said, not only do we need more human rights protection in this country, but we've got to have laws to do so. And they would make reference in particular to the need for a Human Rights Act, or maybe a Human Rights Act or something like that. Something foundational, perhaps in the Constitution, that other countries have. And only the latter two groups would be those people who would not be in the complacent category, and they would amount to about 25% of the population, according to Colma Brunt. Provides another yet different sense of the extent of Australian public support for human rights. What to do about it is my almost second last section. What do people say we should do about it? Who's responsible for protecting human rights? I already made the observation that on this planet, governments are, state parties are. UN Declaration on Human Rights mandates that state parties will protect the rights, the human rights of individuals. And Australians agree. 47% said that the responsibility of government was very high, and 39% said high, and then 11% medium in terms of those response options. 86% then in total agreed that government should have a high responsibility for rights protection. 84% thought that courts also should have a high responsibility for human rights protection. So to our courts and our governments that Australians look for human rights protection. Only 57% supported the need for human rights laws, though, which is odd. Where's that figure that I'm quoting from? Must be on the next slide. Oh, maybe I haven't included it here. Yeah. So there was a question, should we have a human rights law? And only 57% supported that, which is odd. How can only 57% of people say we need laws, and yet 84% want courts and governments to do things? Courts and governments can only do things if we have laws. What it reflects, of course, is at the time there was a lot of debate going on about whether we should have a Human Rights Act. And there was both political parties nationally, more or less, argued against Human Rights Act in this country. So at the same time as the national consultation is going on, there are debates being held, and the governments, the leaders in this country, almost overwhelmingly are arguing against human rights laws and an act. And so it shows up in public opinion, where the public are saying, but I want my governments and my courts to protect human rights, but for some reason I don't want there to be laws, and I don't want there to be a Human Rights Act, and of course that's linked, I would argue, to the debates that were occurring in the country at the time. Otherwise, why would there be such an inconsistency? So here, some of these questions. Parliament to pay attention to human rights when making laws, got agreement on that, support for that. So that's at what, 90%? 85% saying government should pay more attention. And then, if we go to the bottom, a specific human rights laws that define the human rights to which all people in Australia are entitled, so like a declaration almost, then it drops to only the 57% that I made reference to before. So in summary, Australians want to know more about human rights. They want their fellow Australians to know more. They want their governments to protect those rights better. But there's a striking contradiction. On the one hand, Australians want a clearer articulation of human rights, 72% support, yet many balk at that clear definition being enshrined in laws or an act. Case study. Racism again. Take you to the bottom set of data there, last two rows. And this is somebody who's already told the surveyors that they've experienced racism themselves. Okay? This is just those people who have experienced racism themselves. The next question is then, did you seek advice from a Human Rights Commission afterwards? 2%, 2.6% had gone to a Human Rights Commission after having experienced that racism. 4.2% had gone to the Equal Opportunity Commission of South Australia, so that's the South Australians. And amongst those in the ACT, only 2.5%. Really spectacularly low levels of use of our human rights agencies and instruments in responding, in this instance, by victims to the racism that they had experienced. Cast your mind back again to what I said was the most frequent and manifest form of racism in the country. Race hate talk being called the slang name for your cultural group, particularly within that. I showed you some data on where that occurred. We also asked people what they'd done about it. Standout figure is 64% do nothing or pretend it didn't happen. 5.7% made a report. Maybe with one of these human rights organisations, or to a teacher, police, someone in a position of authority. So reporting is low, 5.7%. Interestingly, the most common anti-racist intervention is where the target themselves takes action in the moment. And this is in the form of confronting the perpetrator, attempting a reconciliation, using humour or ridicule to respond. Almost 22%. So this means this is the most common form of anti-racism in the country. And once we saw this figure, by the way, some years ago, this initiated a whole research program for us on what we call bystander anti-racism. Anti-racism that witnesses might do. Because we thought, these are in the public circumstance, targets are taking action themselves, let's look at what witnesses could do, people who are standing by otherwise. And you can suss out that research program on the Challenging Racism Research Project website. But anyway, it also points, I think, to the importance of action beyond government, beyond victims, and the importance of everybody's responsibility in the protection of human rights. Just as there's great potential, political potential in bystander anti-racism, so there will be great political potential in bystander protection of human rights. And it also has the virtue of being in the moment, where most action is taken, and it is beyond being victim-centric. Because too much of our human rights protection relies upon the targets of a human rights infringement having to take the action. And similarly, in racism, much of anti-racism action, our laws, etc., relies upon people who are being targets to become the defenders of anti-racism and the prosecutors of it. So civil society, individuals beyond government, would seem to me, in terms of the research, to be a challenge for human rights protection, and one that could be advanced through human rights awareness raising and education. Summation, and then I'll open for questions and discussion. 75% say that human rights are important. Yay team. 85% say there's a problem with racism. We see the similarities. Only 40% though say that there's Anglo privilege, so there's some political sensibilities here that we have to be aware of. Whose rights comes to play. 85% want action in terms of racism. And we saw similar levels of support for human rights protection. 20% only, though, said their human rights have been infringed, either themselves or someone close to them, vicariously. Similarly, 19% said that they'd been the targets of race hate talk. So you can see, it's a similar story. 25% want further action on human rights. So, human rights education emerges as a priority for developing a stronger human rights system in Australia. No doubt about it. People generally think these things are important. They have a vague sense that we're letting down lots of people. They've been told, though, that we don't want an act or laws, but they want governments and courts to protect our human rights. Let's move on to that. But some challenges first. Portrayals of specific groups influence public sympathy for the human rights of some of those groups. Our case study was asylum seekers. And we also asserted that there will be unique sources or bases for attitudes towards human rights, and in Australia. And in Australia, it might be things like individual freedom, religious freedom, democratic rights, or the fair go. These might be the discursive ideological bases for support for human rights in a country like Australia. And they might be different from other places, which is a theoretical challenge to universality, isn't it? Because it tells us that support for human rights is different from place to place. I'm a geographer. I can't ignore that. That sounds real to me. What to do about it, I guess, is the big issue. Awareness of mechanisms. Australians want clarification. They want clearer definitions of human rights. They want their governments and their courts to protect those human rights, but they're not very keen on additional laws. That might be idiosyncratic to the context when that data was collected and the political debate that was occurring at that time. It might not be, though, as well. It might be that Australians just have that contradiction in their minds. They want governments to do things, they want courts to do things, and they don't like laws. I don't know. Maybe. Anti-authoritarian, but heavily reliant on their government. It actually does sound like Australians, doesn't it? Official protection of human rights in Australia is incomplete. We've got data on that. I hope I would have demonstrated the case for under-reporting, under-enumeration, feeding into complacency. At the moment, we rely upon Australians to defend their own human rights. We over-rely on Australians to defend their own human rights. And they underperform in that regard. Whether it's 2.5% or 4%, depending on how you define a report. So, recapping then the challenges. Complacency. Lack of awareness of human rights violations and whose human rights have been violated. Non-universality. Talked about that. Both across groups and over time as well. So, you know, that agreement that we would have temporal suspensions of people's human rights. Groups' human rights. Because of the deviant behaviour of an individual within that group. Through time, temporal suspension. And then I've already made reference now on a couple of occasions to victim centrism and the problems about that. Oh, here we go, I forgot about this. Did you know that in this school we offer an annual Human Rights Award for the best submission made by any of our students to a public inquiry, to a debate, to a public hearing, whatever the case may be. If you are sending something, if you have a view about a submission or a debate or a policy inquiry in this country, tell us about it. You're in the mix for the prize. All right? And that's the end of my lecture. Questions?
I have a question.
Sorry. Yes, Deborah.
Yes. I'm trusting the students might have noticed this, and you and I spoke during the break, Kevin.
Yes.
There's an interesting anomaly in the data, and it's not necessarily a reflection of a problem with the research, but rather an interesting anomaly in Australians. And that is, there was the data that said Australians thought there was a significant number, 80%, thought more needed to be done about human rights in Australia. But the interesting thing is, wasn't there a significant number who were basically saying that certain groups should actually have less rights?
Okay.
So, do you see that anomaly, people? That at the same time, at one time they're saying more needs to be done, but at the same time they're saying, but not for these people. So, if more needs to be done, but not for those people, then what is the more that needs doing? And who is it for? And was it necessarily that it was a protection of rights when they're saying more needs to be done? Were they actually thinking, yeah, more needs to be done, we need to actually remove them from those people?
I don't know. I think it could be amongst some people's view that, but I think more likely and less spectacularly, it would be that people are pro-human rights, and indeed schools and even most politicians and parties are pro-human rights in their discourse. Okay, that's the generic position. But but then there's a complicated set of debates and discourses around some minority groups, which play out in which generate hostility or at least antipathy, and then that feeds into the ability to transgress the human rights of those groups. Now, I'm not saying that that's a calculated, smoke-filled room process, but it is a process. It happens. It might not be as calculating and as intended as that, but the misrepresentation of certain groups as part of political debate or news media has that effect.
See, I would go one further. I would say it is calculated when it's a political action.
Well, and some people have found evidence for that. I'll come to you in a moment. There were some inquiries into, particularly to take the example of asylum seekers, and I'm thinking of the book Dark Victory in particular, a very incisive analysis of asylum seeker policy development in by both governments or both parties in government. By David, his name will come to you in a moment. Dark Victory was the name of the book, and he found evidence that government told their employees, that the military were told, naval officers were told, that they could not use certain language that would humanise asylum seekers. Yes. They were expressly told, you must not use language which generates sympathy for asylum seekers. It's an amazing thing to tell government employees to do or not do. And I think that when you read that gives you the strongest sense that in fact this was calculated. Yeah, but I think mostly it's not so calculated. But
not in the general public, but certainly in at a political. Yeah.
But that feeds into the public, because if you limit the sorts of representations of asylum seekers, then you construct the public mind. There's a question just here.
The stat said that it was 41% of people said there was no white privilege or anti-white privilege, and yet the same, like 80% of people are saying, yeah, we need to be more about racism and stuff.
Yep.
It's a general lack of understanding of what racism actually is, because if we're not seeing our own privilege, then how can we then say that we need to be more about racism? Because a lot of people have said, oh, well, they're being racist against white people. Well, that kind of doesn't really make any sense.
No, and it is an interesting contradiction, isn't it? And so it does point to one of the tricky aspects of anti-racism action as well, and engaging with privilege. There's been a few sociologists and some of my peers too who've looked into particularly that group, who at the same time are saying there's a problem with racism, but I don't see my own privilege, and this be Anglo say, and it is an interesting set of reasons. For some people, it's understandable. Some working class Anglo-Australians live in pretty tough circumstances. They're in struggle street. And it's really hard for them to get a sense of privilege, all right? Or even cultural privilege. And that's the other thing about privilege is unseen. You know, people who are in privileged cultural positions don't see it. So the broad issue, and then people who are in struggle circumstances wouldn't even contemplate that they're in. So there's a whole set of reasons why things operate in society so that people don't acknowledge that. But raising acknowledgement of that is important, no doubt about it. If you read the anti-racism literature, and I believe that to be the case. At the front here. Okay. So thank you very much. So the question is about a perception that there's lots of discussion of issues all the time in Australia, but there's not enough discussion of solutions and remedies. Lots of issue discussion, not enough discussion of remedies. What are the remedies, is asked. What can be done? So I'll focus my answers in that regard. I agree. There is a lot of discussion of issues and too often no discussion of reasonable remedies and solutions. And that is also true of research, unfortunately. We do a lot of analysis of our culture. We do a lot of analysis of racism. We don't do enough discussion of anti-racism. We don't do enough evaluation of anti-racism programs and interventions and what works and what doesn't. And that is a failing of research in this country, and it's not unusual in the Western world. And that is why doing social science degrees is so important, because you will have the ability to understand how data is generated, how findings are generated. You should have the ability to collect data yourself and to evaluate programs. And that's why being a social scientist is so superior to being a humanities student. Being a social science and psychology is like... So I would agree on that. Well, how to get the government to take action is the next thing. How to get people, and who should take action? Well, a literate public, a public aware of these issues is just so important, isn't it? So literacy raising is important, and I agree with Father Frank Brennan's report in that regard. Didn't do enough, though. You know, the government didn't do enough in following that. But education is one of those places where that can be done. But also, defensible social science, again, is important. You know, uncovering the issues out there in society and evaluating the responses to it is just so important. And so I would look to us again. We can think about government. We can think about getting witnesses and bystanders to take action as well. We can rely on victims to carry the burden. But there's particular things that we all will do as social scientists as well.
Can I
jump
in there? Well, if you remember that Kevin has just talked about the importance of education, and so one hopes that in this is one avenue for it, in raising awareness, but the change very much has to come at different levels. There needs to be political change which feeds into the social structures, the social change. But there needs to be individual change, and there needs to be change in the middle, such as with the media and such like, which actually, again, impact on the general public. But what was interesting, I can take an example from my daughter's previous school, not the school she's in now, but a previous one. And it was a public school. And they raised the question of religious instruction in the school, right? And myself and two other parents, interestingly enough, academics, said, well, how about rather than classes on religious instruction, that what we do is provide classes on ethics and human rights, right? And sort of in that way. And then we're talking about primary school, infants primary school. What was interesting is that the principal went, no, 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 it's religious instruction and that's it. And then what was interesting is that when the options for religious instruction came out, the options for classes were Roman Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, or nothing. So in other words, yes, we can have religious instruction, but only one type. And then but it was deemed that that was their right to practice that. Which one could say, yes, it is. But what was interesting is we were negating the capacity for everyone to be educated in a certain way, which was actually slightly contrary to that initial. So even though we can argue that yes, we need the education, that sometimes the education is seen as a threat. Sometimes it's seen as a threat. And let's be honest, I'm sure some of you in this room have experienced from what you have been presented in these classes, you have felt your own experiences to be slightly, the boundaries to have been pushed and poked and prodded a bit. And so we get the, oh, it's just, and so go off and negate it. So unfortunately what happens is that sometimes the education is seen as a threat, and yet it's the education that is actually required, because what is threatened is the position of privilege. That's what's being threatened. Sorry, I'm taking over your...
I read an interview with Julia Triggs, and she had a lot of problems with politicians attacking her and trying to discredit her. And her comments were that even if politicians aren't educated in human rights, they don't know enough about it. And so I think that's probably why, or maybe why we have such a problem at the high end of town, like politicians and policy making about human rights, especially with politicians. They don't have the education to understand it properly. I'd like to comments. I'm very interesting.
No, I think you're right. The awareness of human rights amongst our political class now is not what you would hope. And it reflects the awareness of human rights in the population, I guess, and goes to the issue of education again, awareness raising. Gillian Triggs, who's the president of the Human Rights Commission that the student makes reference to, in her recent reports on this, she mentioned that in Senate estimates committees, she'd be talking with politicians and explaining, you know, how we'd signed this charter or that charter and signed up to various declarations in the rights area, and the politicians would say, oh, we should never have signed that. Rather than agreeing with her that, oh, look, you know, we better be careful because we're out of step with what we've agreed to. Their response was, well, that was a mistake. So the question is, can we be optimistic or should we be pessimistic in the times we're in and in the future? And I think there's scope for some pessimism, that we're not perhaps getting the improvements in attitudes that we would like and improvements in awareness. But, and you know, so for instance, you know, negative sentiment towards Australians who of the Islamic faith are going really bad and going in the wrong direction. So that this is deeply unfortunate. But by the same token, there's plenty of positives as well, I think. And the education system's one of the most important of those. I've always said that in my own area of work, which is racism and anti-racism, the most influential anti-racism that gets done in the country at the moment is in schools, both within curriculum and extracurricular. And it's been the source of the success we have in terms of tolerance on diversity and the like. So there are some positives. We have a multicultural policy in this country. Many Western nations are turning away from that. And so that's another positive as well. And we are hearing more and more about people taking action as bystanders and speaking up and speaking out when they witness transgressions of human rights. And that's certainly something that we can all help encourage and try and do ourselves where it's safe to do so. So on that positive note, we should end.